The module operates in virtue of an AC excitation that then induces surface currents on the body of the vehicle or other metallic structure in which it's connected to. And the nature of electromagnetic signals, especially when you excite, say, a metal object with them, is that they go everywhere. That's partly responsible by the virtue of the fact that it decays in strength by an inverse square law. And those of you who understand mathematics, you have to go to infinity, an infinite distance away for the electric field to go to zero. And of course, on a vehicle, the furthest you can get away from, say, the excitation point is maybe 10, 20 feet. Well, you're a long way from infinite distance away. And so the signal is going to be present, and it's going to be present everywhere. Now, granted, it's not the same strength everywhere, but still it goes everywhere. And we've demonstrated in the laboratory that very weak surface currents can still significantly reduce the corrosion rate. In fact, we've studied surface current strengths over 3 orders of magnitude, in other words, 1,000 times less than what we're currently using, and we still see a significant effect. So we haven't found out how weak it can be, but it can be awfully weak and still protect. And so we put the signal everywhere in the vehicle because it's just a property of electrodynamics. And the signals can be very weak and still protect. So we're very confident that we can adequately cover a vehicle. I guess one of the ways that you could look at it and try to understand it is think of a box or 2 pieces of metal that are close together, and think about water. See, if I were to have a box that was, had crevices and cavities all through it, if I were to fill it with water, the water would go everywhere. It'd be virtually impossible to keep it from going to every little nook and cranny. Just think of how hard it is to keep things from leaking that are complicated. Well, it's just sort of like that. Water just naturally wants to do that. You can't keep it from doing that. The electric field excitation is much like that. Nature just wants to have that signal go everywhere. If you compare this technology to, say, chemical protection methods, as we know, it's simply impossible to apply a chemical to every surface on the vehicle. They're simply not accessible. So, well, in fact, there's a great deal of the automotive surface, namely on the inside, that isn't accessible. And certainly you can't apply a heavy a chemical coating to the paint. It would make it look rather bad. Whereas the module, because that signal goes everywhere on the surface of that vehicle, you really can protect the whole thing. Whereas it's simply not possible to cover all the surfaces of a vehicle with a chemical protection. A lot of interest has been generated in virtue of the production of the aluminum F-150 in 2015. And a big question arises, can the module protect aluminum? Well, to answer that question requires an awful lot of research with very sophisticated equipment and a lot of time. It's not the kind of question you're going to answer immediately. We're not going to go into the laboratory. No one's going to go into a laboratory and in a couple of weeks find out how the module operates on aluminum. Our hope is that it does work on aluminum. There's some anecdotal information that would indicate that it might, but that's not scientific proof. And before we would begin selling a product claiming that it worked on aluminum or any other metal, we would have to cross our T's and dot our I's scientifically in the laboratory and verify that it works, not only in just one electrolyte, say an electrolyte that might be commonly present in the road environment, but a lot of other electrochemical environments. So it's a question that's very important today. It's not a question we can answer right away, but we are beginning research in that field. We have a number of studies that are being conducted in the Q-fog chambers. There's potentiostatic, potentiodynamic. We're using electroimpedance spectroscopy to study the problem, as well as looking at the breakdown potential of aluminum oxide films in various electrolytes, and using fitting from electroimpedance spectroscopy data on Dr. McDonald's point defect model to actually really try to understand what effect the module has on the zinc oxide layer. There's some modules that are currently sold on the market that are claimed to be cathodic protection devices. And of course, cathodic protection cannot be used on a vehicle because there's no electrolyte present at all times. But some of these modules operate with a very high voltage, sometimes as high as 800 volts, on a capacitive pad that's stuck to the vehicle. And the concern here is if the dielectric layer that insulates that capacitive pad from the car body were to be breached, you would have an electrical path from, say, you, the installer, to the 800 volts on that pad. And that sounds like a bad deal, and it would give you a bit of a jolt. It would be uncomfortable. However, you wouldn't die from it because there isn't enough power behind it. But nevertheless, you would get a significant jolt from it. It wouldn't feel good. And with our module, it operates down at, I think the peak pulse on, say, a typical car would be around 10 volts. And it's there for about 3 microseconds. And it doesn't appear for another 97 microseconds. So it's very brief, it's very small, and there's no way a person can ever feel it. So it's perfectly safe. There's a big effort on our part to make sure that the module draws very, very little current. And it draws very little current. And the power drain is a nominal 250 microamps. That's 1/4 of a milliamp. And a milliamp is 1/1000th of an amp. So it's a very tiny current. And from at least one car manufacturer that we've talked to, when we told them what the current draw was, they said, that's insignificant, we don't care. Other modules that are cathodic based, specifically those that generate high voltages, they generally draw significant current. It's because of the method that they use to generate the high voltages. That's difficult to do with very, very low powers. You're at least going to have to draw 5 to 10 milliamps of power to generate these high voltage signals that unfortunately don't work in protecting a car against corrosion. Some of the other modules are very simple, and they just use, say, a 5-volt power supply that generates 5 volts, and it takes very little current. But unfortunately, those don't do anything because cathodic systems don't work on a vehicle, and putting 5 volts on a vehicle really doesn't do anything at all. So they're low power, but they're not effective. But even they don't generally get into power levels like such as we have in our product.